Asif, the series has been very, very successful, and the research methodology course has generally, for its 23 sessions spread over 7 modules that you saw initially, has sort of bagged over 15,000 registrants from different parts of the world. And there are 10,000, more than 10,000 national and another 2,000 plus international registrants from 122 countries and literally all the regions of the world. It was amazing to see people register from South America to New Zealand to, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and so on. That essentially means that each one of the registrants will walk away post-webinar, post-series actually, the videos, the YouTube videos, recordings, and the resources and the PowerPoints as shared by the expert. Today's session is about literature review, and very interestingly, Asif calls it engaging with the text. That makes you realize that it's not about copy-pasting or even putting the text literature that you have read into your literature review. It's about engaging with it and putting your own spin to it. And for that, you have to, you have to first review a lot of material. He will talk you through that. And what does reviewing of material mean? And Asif has a way of explaining where he says how every discipline is interrelated, and your literature review could span beyond your own discipline. And then what is a good, well-written analysis, how to transform the research idea into research questions, and most importantly, what is missing a lot of times in the research that I see is the theoretical construct and the theoretical framework. We never sort of refer, most by and large, many of us don't refer to the literature review to construct the framework, which will actually, on which you will place your rest of the research, the methodology, how you're going to take the research forward. So who is this brilliant person who is going to guide us through these different steps? Asif Tiftahar is a teaching fellow. He's also a close friend from Lum School of Humanities and Social Sciences. And he's a teaching fellow over there. And he has been teaching since 3 decades in various places, including Punjab University, Pakistan College of Law, Civil Services Academy, and McGill University. His academic he has coordinated at LUMS the Berkeley Urdu language program in collaboration with the American Institute of Pakistan Studies. He's a published poet and a translator, and you will be pleasantly surprised by him sprinkling his talk with Persian, maybe Arabic, and some poetry. And that makes it far more exciting and relatable. His academic work spans Islamic law, jihad, and movements in South Asia, Islamic modernism and tradition, Quranic and comparative religious studies, and Islamic finance and ethics. And I think that's why, because of you have been a part of many banking systems where you have talked of Islamic bank, ethics of Islamic banking. So without much ado, over to you, Asif, and for your brilliant expose. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruxana. Might I please ask you how many minutes you expect to speak, and how many minutes have you specified for Q&A?
Yeah, we try to leave 20 minutes for Q&A, so you have another 35 minutes for your talk and to cover all the agenda items, one by one that I stated.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Ruxana, for this opportunity to talk to such distinguished participants. I'm, as always, going to focus more on what is not obvious. When we talk about literature review, you can just open up your ChatGPT and get some important points on what needs to be done. And there's a checklist. We all know aspects of the procedure, which we have to follow. So those are points that I'm going to not talk about. And as Dr. Samuel Johnson, one of the most well-known lexicographers of English language, would say, let's talk about what is not obvious rather than what is obvious. So nevertheless, just to enumerate some of the points that are important in literature review, contextualization, gap identification, theoretical alignment, methodological guidance. These are some of the important points that we discuss in literature review. These are some of the reasons we want to contextualize, we want to identify the gaps, we want to be theoretically aligned, which is very important, and we want to be as certain as possible uh, about our own methodological approaches or interpretive approaches. Now, excuse me, just get the phone out of the way somehow. Even with silence, it's an intervention. So when we talk about literature review, the first question that comes to mind is, well, it's a mandatory part. Why is it so important? Um, is it just something that we do because we need some canvas in which to place our research, and that is about it, and then the rest is up to us, and we can just add our bit of research, special, and that especially applies to empirical research, scientific research, in which we are focusing more on experimentation, on observation, on gathering data, information. And that seems to be the more important aspect. That seems to be the more important contribution. Nevertheless, when we look at how things are depicted and how things are understood, we realize very soon that one of the most important aspects of modern research and academic writing has to do with hermeneutics. Uh, and that's why I hope everybody is well aware of what hermeneutics focuses upon. If there are any questions, we can discuss them first.
Yeah.
So that
Please,
we,
please very briefly explain what is hermeneutics.
yeah, the word comes from the Greek god Hermes, the winged messenger who would bring the unintelligible message of God, of the gods to mortals and make them intelligible to them. But in discourse analysis, it applies to understanding any text, and the text could be just about anything. It could be the written text, which is the focus, as Jacques Derrida also said. The Western discourse is quite logocentric. It's more focused on the written word and text seen as a form of some kind of writing which has to be interpreted, and that's where the whole issue emerges from. What are we reading? How are we understanding it? What are the criteria vis-a-vis which we understand something? It complicates everything, and it is for this reason that we see that even in the development of AI, which is artificial intelligence, one of the most challenging area is the hermeneutical part, the art and science of interpretation of text. And text could be, as I said, in modern hermeneutics, it could be anything ranging from the written text. It became an important field of study in biblical sciences when in the Rome when scholars as Martin Luther broke away from the authority of the church, because that they were defining what the text really meant. They had the power, the authority. They were defining the will of God, or in modern terms, or hermeneutical terms, the authorial intentionality was decided by the church. But when Martin Luther broke away, he was talking about why the text itself is important. And as interpreters, we have the right to go into the text and look into the text and come up with our interpretation of the text and see whether what it says, and therefore the text became important. And ranging from, I think Faisal Bari, I guess, might have talked a little bit about these aspects, ranging from scholars or approaches identified with German scholars as Schleiermacher, who are focusing more on the text, saying text is sufficient unto itself, to Gadamer, who was also talking about contextualization, the pretext, the context, to Marxist hermeneutics, which focused also on the power dynamics behind what is being said and written, to postmodernist and post-structuralist hermeneutics, where we are talking about petite narratives. This narrative building and this depiction is one of the most important aspects of what the text says. And even with AI, the importance has not reduced. It has only become far more significant. It's no surprise, therefore, that a field which primarily used to belong to the humanities stream, hermeneutics, is now studied far more at MIT than any other institution, simply because up to now, most of the models of AI that have been developed, artificial intelligence that have been developed, have emerged out of probability algorithms. And I recently wrote an article for King Fahd University on how there is still a possibility of using hermeneutical models, which is one of the most difficult aspects of learning. So in engaging with texts, one of the most important things is to be aware of the biases, as Gadamer would say. There are always biases in which a text is studied. Let's take the example of something beyond the written word, the Taj Mahal, for instance. You look at the Taj Mahal, and it's something you can interpret. A piece of art, for instance, a human being, for instance, an event. All of these are texts in modern hermeneutics which have to be interpreted. You look at the Taj Mahal, and the usual response is, well, it's a symbol of love, amour. There was this emperor. It's a beautiful story. But then, in comes a poet like Sahir Ludhianvi, whose very famous Indian song is well known to people in South Asia, Kabhi Kabhi Mere Dil Mein Khayal Aata Hai. Rukhsana, you must have, I translated that as well. So people can, look at the translation. He comes there, and he, because he's a Marxist, he looks at the Taj Mahal and says, well, there's this emperor, what amour, what love. There's this emperor who puts 22,000 laborers to work. He's a despotic ruler, and this wife of his made famous by his love, constructed by the imagination of whoever made those constructions of interpretation, is the eighth wife, bearing about perhaps the 13th or 14th child, and dies, and 22,000 laborers work on it, and he becomes the greatest lover of all times, one of the most significant lovers. And he says, ये मुनक्कश दरो दीवार, ये मेहराब, ये ताक, एक शहंशाह ने दौलत का सहारा लेकर हम गरीबों की मोहब्बत का उड़ाया है मजाक, मेरी महबूब कहीं और मिलाकर मुझसे. If you Google, the Taj Mahal, and write Asif Takhar, you will see a translation of this, where this poem, there's a full translation of this poem where he says that I refuse to accept this palace as a symbol of love. It's a symbol of exploitation, whereby an emperor, is so it's the same text, but it's giving a different interpretation altogether. We see that in political science always. We see that in economics. We see that in literature. We see that in science as well. The idea is that science, perhaps, the Faisal Bari, I could see from the rubrics, talked about logical positivism. So there was this idea that's so precise and defined and doesn't have its own biases. But then there are terms. What is zero for one person? What is one for another person? These things have to be defined. What is nothingness, for instance? Stephen Hawking, for instance, talked about the nothingness as the foundation. But when he talks about nothingness, it's not the philosophical nothingness of Adam, as we used to call it in Arabic. It's the nothingness which has properties and energy field. He could have called it X or anything, and creates a whole new idea and reminds us of the debate that Louis Pasteur, for instance, had in Ecole Normale, when the idea of spontaneous generation became what is known as a fact. It was presented as a fact that spontaneous generation was possible, and it kind of created ripples in discourses, religious discourses, philosophical discourses. Life can emerge out of nothingness, but then in comes Pasteur, and they could show that through experiment, through observation, under set conditions, repeat that. All the and the scholars of science, all the scientists around them had their ijma on it, their consensus on it. So, by all definitions of logical positivism, before Popper critiqued it with his falsification idea, it was a fact. And in comes Louis Pasteur, and critiques that idea. He's able to pasteurize the containers in which life was supposedly emerging out of nothingness, and was saying, now do it. And he completely falsified the idea. So that too depends on your interpretation and your biases. So one of the most important things of literature review is to be aware of what has already been done. I mean, when you begin to read your text, when you select your list and you engage with your text, you have to understand what is the context in which that text has emerged, what is the language around it, what are the biases around it, what are the controversies, so that when you read it, you are engaging it intelligently and not taking that as a fact without even probing into these aspects of interpretation. Because at the end of it, when it comes to us, it is nevertheless an interpretation. So some of the more important aspects and practical aspects which need to be kept in mind when we engage with the text, as Ruxana appropriated the term. The first thing obviously is I have a research goal, could be a hypothesis I want to test, could be some questions I want to raise, could be an exploration I want to make, could be an observation that I want to make. Whatever your research goal is, the first thing is, where do I get information about it? And the typical, I've seen university professors do it. The typical starting point is ChatGPT or Google. I call it Sheikh Google, this is the Google Scholar. And or other, and now we have search engines, the academia and others where we can find papers. But what else do you suppose might be possible? Any suggestions? What else do we need to know? Because one of the most important aspects in making your list of literature review and then going on to deciding about how to approach the text, how to read the text. The first thing you need to do is what not to read, because there's so much out there. What not to read, what not to include, and that applies to defining your research goal as well. What is it that I'm not researching is far more important at times than the idea of what I am researching. So apart from these search engines, and they are specialized encyclopedias, for instance, in courses on religion, for instance, that I teach, philosophy that I teach, languages, they are specialized inside. Like in Islamic studies, we have E.J. Brill's brilliant Encyclopedia of Islam, which will give you, we have Index Islamicus, which will give you a list of everything published under the sun in English language on a particular topic, reviews on, reviews on any article written by particular authors you want to write. You have all that information with you. But there's so much out there. You go to Index Islamicus, You want to review a simple article written by a scholar and you put it there. It will give you all the reviews that have already been written. You go to E.J. Brill's Encyclopedia of Islam. It will give you the background information. You go to academia. It will give you a list of all of the relevant articles. How do you decide to not read some of these aspects? And that's very, very important, because one of the challenges, one of the monsters of modern research is the availability of information. It's not always the non-availability of information, it's the availability of information. And quite often I recite this joke. I was talking to a very renowned scholar some time ago, and he was talking about whether you've done this, whether you read that. And I see that at some of the best institutions that I've worked with, scholars from McGill, from Harvard, from Chicago, they will always, whenever you have a topic, have you read this? Have you read this? Have you read that? And that's very problematic, because when you and maybe in the European model, there's still a greater focus, but in the American and the Canadian, system, there's a lot of focus on exploring just about everything that is related. And I often relate this joke about this old man who was, old farmer who was driving his tractor to his fields, and suddenly a city kid comes in his flashy, Ferrari, and he opens the door and says, "Hey, pops, do you know the way to such and such place?" And he says, he's puffing on his pipe, and he says, "Nope." And then he says, "Well, do you know the way to such and such place?" And he says, "Nope." The third and fourth time, "Well, you might at least know this hotel." And he says, "Nope." And the city kid gets infuriated and says, "Hey, old man, do you know anything at all?" So he takes a big puff on his pipe and says, "Son, I ain't the one who's lost." You know, it's you who have to find your way. I know where to go. So one important thing is to find out what not to read. And the first question is, how do you decide that? So what are some of the suggestions? Where do you go for that?
As if they won't be able to respond. So I guess the best way would be to give
Okay,
your own.
so you just want to me to finish, like, I mean, I can
So I
respond to my.
think I would say go to the primary or the basic primary perhaps sources. I would go to journals. I usually start. Now I start with AI, but I'd like to have your take on it.
Yeah. So I quite often like to recite a couplet by Iqbal on this, where he says, "In kare hakimi nist damane kalimi gir." And this is not something which you can always acquire through just ordinary sources. You need to have a person. Yek banda darya mast, yek sad banda sahil mast. So something like that, where he says that for such endeavors, you need to find out the person who has delved into that ocean. One of the most important things we have lost touch with is the idea of contacting the right people. Despite all these devices and search engines, it's very important to look out for people who have done that work, for the right professors, scholars, and fish out their information, and to make contacts with them, because those who have spent time will give you information far beyond what is already available through AI. At a recent conference on trends in Islamic traditions in South Asia at LUMS, while talking to some international scholars, we were discussing how information overload has become one of the biggest nightmares of research. There's so much out there, and you need to know, and just a little bit before ChatGPT and all these devices that have come up with AI and HCI. Um, this kind of information provided by a scholar, by a researcher, was considered to be great research. There was an adage that if you plagiarize from one book, if you copy from one book, it's plagiarism. If you copy from many and cite it properly, it's a PhD. That was the joke. but it really used to work. The more information you had, the more citations you had, the more data you had collected, that was great research. But with these things, all of that has already kind of is becoming redundant or has become redundant. What is far more important is knowing what not to research, selecting the right literature through the right people, through the right scholars, apart from these search engines, from these research sources. The most important thing is to get in touch with the right people. That's number one. Number two, when you engage with the text, obviously you will have to define your research goal and you read those texts vis-a-vis your research goals. Are you investigating? Are you looking? Let's, for instance, take one of the research goals, a fashionable research goal, and a useful one too, which is comparison of different approaches. I'll give you an example from my own field. Let's say you want to evaluate a traditionalist Islamic scholar with an Islamist, traditional Islamic, traditionalist Islamic scholar with, let's say, a reformist, or an Islamist scholar, Nifazi Islam, Islamist scholar with a post-Islamist scholar. And you want to analyze their approaches and why some of them are coming up with entirely different, one is arguing for the obligation of jihad. This is something that happened very recently when, Mufti Taqi Usmani here gave a fatwa, followed by some other, schools like Mufti Munib, who made it obligatory upon every Pakistani Muslim to go for jihad, as opposed to other scholars or in the marginalized area who were giving an entirely different argument. And that became a problem for some people. I mean, I had student alums who would come to me, are we obliged to leave our studies and go because this is what some of the scholars, where are they coming from? If I want to make that comparison, if that's my research goal, where are they coming from? What are their approaches? Which has greater strength and which has lesser strength? And how do you kind of put it in front of your reader who wants to know, and you want to do the act of the researcher? Then obviously you're going to gather data on it. You're going to collect literature on it. And then, of course, you're going to decide on how to engage with it. So the first important aspect is getting to the right people, finding out what not to read because there's already so much literature on it, and then developing an approach to reading the text. You have to understand what are the hermeneutical approaches that are in place in the Western academia, because you have to make a comparison with that. You also have to be aware of the tradition in which you are into which you are delving. As Talal Asad points out, there's a discursiveness of tradition. There's a discursiveness in the discourses, and the discursiveness is very, very important, because if you want to add something to the discourse, I mean, one example is research, that excellent piece of research that is being done by Ruxana's brilliant son, whom I often like to mention, Dr. Bilal Malik, who did his PhD in education from Harvard. And I can proudly say that, that's a plant that I had also watered to some extent, because he was my supervisee in his research project at LAMS, where he began this research on madrasa education, for instance. Now, so many people want to talk about it, and they will go to Google, they will go to research engines. They do not have an idea of what the discourse is. They do not have an idea of the discursiveness. What is discursiveness? Now, it's an important thing to understand, because when you are reading something and you're reading things ethically and inically, you're looking from the tradition from within and from without, from the outside. Both approaches require an understanding of the discursiveness. Talal Asad would define it as, when discourse happens, when people are engaging with each other, when there's a conversation. And that's why Gadamer likes to think of, discourse analysis as a kind of a conversation which has gone on over a period. There's certain rules which are set. I'll just give you a recent example of what happens. and how a lacuna created in modern significant research. It's not about collecting data. It's not just about collecting data. Data collection is important. It's not just about experimentation. It's how you place and how you analyze the text you're engaging with, even before you add your own bit to it. So recently, there was a Princeton professor. There is a Princeton professor, well-known Princeton professor, who wrote, who gave a talk at LAMS, and she pointed out, she gave hadith, these are sayings or records of Prophet's actions or speech or tacit approvals, where she said that there was this occasion where the Prophet, like looked at a certain way of plantation and objected to it, and then people, thought that this objection had to be followed, and they followed that directive, and the plantation failed. And then the Prophet later on said that you are more aware of worldly matters than I am. So her idea was to point out that religion has its confinement, the popular notion that the Prophet knew just about everything, and religion should encroach upon every space of human, activity, has to be confined. And she quoted this hadith. Very soon to be met with, as soon as she did, there was a lot of retaliation against what she said. And then, she was obviously trying to defend herself. But here's the problem. I mean, interestingly, Shah Waliullah, a very, very well-known name, had also given a similar opinion, not the same opinion, a similar opinion. But what she did not realize, he was quoting from Muslim, which is one of the most, considered to be one of the most authoritative and highly venerated sources of hadith literature. But what she did not know was the approach because this is what discursiveness is about. Do you know the rules of the trade? Do you know how the tradition has developed? Do you really understand how the tradition works? And she could not understand how Muslim, for instance, has a seminal kind of a narration followed by corroborative ones, and there's a epistemology and epistemological hierarchy in which weaker, stronger are placed after that just for corroborative purposes, but the rest, even though they are in Muslim, might be of a lesser category in terms of authenticity. And the variation in words would matter. So the stronger one said that the Prophet had initially stopped them, and the plantation, did not fail. So it's in that way. It was their misunderstanding, but the Prophet had already warned them that not to follow his directive. So it gives a very different picture. Now, if you haven't done that groundwork, if you're not aware of that tradition, there's going to be a huge problem. Other aspects of of textual analysis would include one of the most important key terms, because I'm running out of time, so I'll just briefly mention it. That's the idea of intertextuality. That's very, very important, that when you have terms, people, two concepts that are important are what in logic is termed as argumentum ad verecundiam, not to be swayed by big names without critically analyzing them, and to be fully aware of the intertextuality of the terms that are being used, because the terms will change over time. And to put them in the right context, you need to understand what is the history of the development of that term before you appropriate it and apply it to your own situation. There are a number of works coming from some of the best universities on Ghalib, for instance. I mean, there were presentations at LAMS recently by two well-known scholars, but some of them were not aware of the intertextuality, and that would result in a totally different interpretation from how it has been traditionally understood. And maybe you can deconstruct it, but you first need to know the rules of the game before you can do that. Roxana, I'll just stop here, because I hope I've raised enough questions for more discussion, because that's the time you gave me. And
That's a good idea. we have a pretty good idea of what you say when you say that it's a hermeneutic way approach to literature review, and how you have tried to extrapolate the different possibilities in engaging with the text. There are quite many questions now, and I am trying to answer some along the way, but did not. There was some content question about different types of literature review, and I've responded that there are many you can find on the net. That's something you don't need a session about. Gohar, Fatma, either of you, please will you state the
Yes, ma'am.
questions?
I'm going to share the
Please.
questions with you. Waleed Khan and Vishwas Das have asked the same question. They're asking that how should we approach a literature review when the topic is recent or lacks substantial prior research?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it's quite often asked. Sometimes you come across you explore something which is entirely new. It reminds me of one of my professors at McGill in my PhD program, whose name is Professor Robert Wisnowski. Used to be at Harvard first, one of the most well-known scholars on Greek and Latin philosophy and interaction of Greek and Latin philosophy with Arabian and Persian philosophy. And every year, when he offers a course, he selects a book, some manuscript that his students have to read. That was my only course in my full PhD program, in which I had an A minus. Otherwise, I had straight A's all along. But it was a difficult course taught by two professors, and he would just select a work which nobody had worked upon earlier. There's no precedent, no interpretations, and you have to do it all anew. So when you have a topic which nobody has researched and it's all anew, you do think that it's in vacuum. You do think that what Talal Asad calls the discursiveness is absent there, and it's in a vacuum and it's a new area, but it is not. It is often not. We all stand on the shoulders of previous researchers. There are always related areas. For instance, I'll just give you this example, and some of the translations on epistemology that I did on that book that we were studying. Nobody had it was such a difficult course. There were, I remember, two professors were teaching it, 5 professors were studying it. There were 3 PhD students, including myself, and 2 master students. And when we'd walk through the corridors, people say, "Oh, these are the guys that are doing this kind of research." It was goddamn difficult, like it was really difficult to decipher. And sometimes, for 15 minutes, the whole class would be silent, just looking at the text, and you would have no idea of how to interpret it. Yet, this was a work. It was worked by Abu Rashid Nisaburi, who was the student of Qadi Abdul Jabbar, one of the most well-known Mutazilite scholars. So now you are researching that. It's a new text. Nobody has interpreted it. Nobody has given a gloss on it. Nobody has given any kind of review on it. You're doing it for the first time. But the Mutazilite philosophy is not in a vacuum. And in a certain sense, it was a mulakkas. It was a summary of, or emanate, if not an exact summary, it was emanating from the 30-volume work of his master, Qadi Abdul Jabbar. So there are always related works around from which you develop a canvas and a context. And you then try to place it within that context and move on from there to develop your criteria. I hope I've answered that question, but obviously this is something you do with the help of your supervisor, with people in the field. It's a difficult thing to do, but the rewards are immense, because then you are breaking ground. This kind of research can be groundbreaking.
Thank you so much, sir. So as you were talking during the session that there's a lot of material out there. We have a question from Mr. Joseph. He's asking that what are your preferred techniques for deciding on which literature to read and what not to read when you're doing a comprehensive literature review that critically engages with the text?
Yeah, as I said, this is one of the most difficult things in our times, when there's information overload. And you can use your, when you have gone through one or two basic texts, you do get an idea. You also compare it with the scope of your own research goals. But ultimately, in my experience, until you have guidance from some of the scholars who have actually, some of the well-known figures in the field, who are able to tell you where to stop, it becomes very tricky. It becomes very tricky. I mean, we've all done our every PhD does, at least in the American or Canadian model, you do your comprehensive exams, in which you sometimes have to go through about 200 different sources, and you have to decide. I remember in my Islamic law comprehensive exams, my professor, with whom I had a lot of altercations on discourse, so he really didn't like me, although he gave me an A. So I had to select about 40 sources for his subfield, which was Islamic law, which I was focusing upon at that time. And for that, he made me annotate about 100 sources, and he said that's not enough. So I had to do 200, and he said that's not enough. So I got angry, and that happens to a person when you have Rajput or Pashtun genes, which I have. So I spent 2 months and I annotated about 1,000 sources, which he couldn't go through for the next many months. But finally, we had to put it down to 40. And if you have the right people, they will not let you go through that detour, because detours are one of the most one of the most demonic pitfalls in doing research. You go into areas where you are not supposed to go. It's not pertinent. So apart from comparison with your own scope and identifying, narrowing down your scope and reading vis-a-vis that, getting help from search engines, it's very important that you contact the established scholars in the field for their guidance on what not to read.
Thank you so much, sir. Moving on, we have a question from Dr. Zalif. She asked that could you clarify how bias arises in literature reviews, given that the source are supposed to be evidence-based?
Given that?
Given that the sources are supposed to be evidence-based.
Yes, that's a very important question, and perhaps, at least in my field, it's one of the most important issues that one has to deal with. I remember my one of my professors, Professor Wael Halak, who's now a professor of Islamic law at Columbia University. He would often say, this idea that research and well-researched, discourses, well-researched papers or books are without biases is just a myth. Almost every writing has its biases and prejudices, and it's important to understand where they come from. Part of that happens when you have done when your research, your literature review is balanced and is well spread and well connected, and you realize through that any person who's talking, and the trend in modern research, as you all know, is towards deconstruction. People generally in research now do not like to posit ideas as assertions. There's a greater tendency on deconstructing given ideas, and same applies in science as well, where since Popper's times, there's more emphasis on falsification than on bringing something new. Unless, of course, it's pure research, you find a new species of some biological organism. That's a different area altogether. But when interpretation comes in, when you talk about interpretive discourses, then of course these biases are there. Having a good idea of the theoretical frameworks. I'll give you one example. If you pick up Amina Wadud, or Amina Wadud, as some people call her, and you look at her work, Quran and Women Islam, and she begins with a claim that she's not a feminist. All feminists like Asma Barlas, Fatma Murnisi would be appropriating her work. People are talking about it. Later on, she modifies her work. and she's talking about how patriarchal readings had created their own biases, and then she's appropriating Dr. Fazlur Rahman of University of Chicago, not the other Fazlur Rahman, and Maulana Minas and Islahi. These are the people she's appropriating. You have to look at the people she's appropriating, look at the people she's critiquing, to understand what exactly is the ambit of her own biases. I mean, who are the people she's appropriating? Who are the people she's critiquing? And go into that, and then you will realize where the person stands.
Thank you, sir. Moving forward, we have a question from Imama Riaz. She's asking that how do social, political, or cultural contexts shape our interpretation of academic texts during literature review?
Again, a very important question. And I think not being aware of those aspects is a major pitfall as far as I'm concerned. Sometimes, I mean, we do not confess it quite often, but when we are aware of these aspects, we also are sometimes confined by them. It's not possible for every researcher to break away from that kind of discursiveness, or that kind of or that kind of confine of ethos, because wherever you go, I mean, the idea that if you go to Harvard, for instance, you'll have an environment where there are no biases whatsoever, where cultural influences are not there, even to the extent of the language you use, what kind of diction you are using. As soon, for instance, let me give you an idea. As soon as you say, I've seen a number of research papers written at Punjab University, and they will always say, they'll quite often come up with the statements like, uh, the truth, what true Islam says, or the truth of Islam as depicted by the Quran is, or this paper intends to bring out the true message of Islam. Just to give you an example. Now, this statement itself, if it's given in the context of a Western academia, is a big no-no. The moment you say I'm presenting the true message, well, you're making huge loaded claims. You are saying that everybody else has not understood. You have understood the true intentionality of the text, which many postmodernists would argue is already an elusive kind of a goal in research, in engaging with text as we speak. I would suggest most of you to go through at least Jonathan Culler's brief introduction to critical studies, to understand why this kind of statement will be problematic. So most people will probably, in the Western academia, talk about sharing their view, or sharing their perspective, or sharing their analysis, rather than disseminating the truth. So disseminating itself is very problematic. Sharing the truth, having a claim on truth, these are contexts which, even in terms of the appropriation of language, can be very problematic. So you have to be aware of where you are speaking, how you are speaking, what are the biases, what are the research approaches, how do you establish, how do you establish are you going to talk about veracity, for instance, as Dr. Asad Ahmed from Berkeley recently said in one of his lectures here at Lahore while he was here? Are you talking about veracity? Are you talking about truthfulness? Are you talking about authenticity? Are you talking about an interpretive aspect? Be aware of that. If you're not, then you will be making loaded statements that will get you into a lot of problem and critique by your peers and reviewers. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We have a question from Wali Suleiman Khail. He's asking that with so many tools and AI resources available, how can we efficiently sift through the overwhelming volume of research to focus on what's more relevant to our topic. And in addition to that, we also have a question from Rana Usman that he's asking that how important is it to consider a scholar's historical and cultural background and possible biases when interpreting their work?
Yeah. I mean, what was the first question, please?
With so many tools and AI resources available, how can we efficiently sift through the overwhelming volume of research to
Yes, I
focus on
mean,
what's more relevant?
of course, in different fields, the approaches will be different. As I said, the first and the most important thing is apart from all these tools and search engines and databases, you need to get in touch with the right people who have done research in that area. But the second important thing is also in terms of, I mean, we're not doing a workshop here. It's these are general discussions. But if there was a there was a workshop in which we could have, if we had more time and we could work on some models, then we could, reify through examples on how this is done. But I'll give you one or two examples. I recently wrote an article on reinterpretation of certain laws on inheritance, especially regarding daughters' shares, and had the opportunity of presenting it at the Supreme Court of Pakistan very recently. Now, there's so much written on inheritance. So, in defining your research goals, also, because of these devices, AI and HCI and what have you, uh, almost everything is changing. The way we are I mean, in the field of education, we're all most of us are in the field of education. We know that we are redesigning our exams. We are redesigning the way we teach. So we also have to redesign the way we do research. As I said, it's not just about gathering information like it used to. I mean, it can so easily be done just sitting at your desk. You have so much information already there. So the important thing is, in your research, also in defining your research, if you can ask yourself this question: what is my intervention? What is my intervention? All that data is already there. If, unless of course you're bringing, there are researchers, as Professor Wael Halak at Columbia would say, there are researchers whose job is to go to, let's say, a remote area, dig up a cave and find some, piece of architecture or some living organism or a manuscript, and that's an addition to research. Well, that's considered a contribution. But if you're engaged in terms of analysis of discourses, then so much information is already digitalized, it's already online. Where is your intervention? If you can define that intervention, that this is where I'm intervening, this is where my analysis comes in. Let's say, for instance, you are analyzing discourse and you are presenting a new philological aspect that nobody else has done. Well, that's your intervention. And that's what you need to work upon. For instance, in this article that I was talking about, I was looking at the philology of certain verses. And therefore, I was focusing on tafasir, classical tafasir and other tafasir, who were just talking about the philology. So automatically, and by virtue of this goal of intervention, so many other tafasir just get out of my way, and and it becomes a new contribution because nobody else has done that before. So I hope that example kind of gives you an idea. And of course, it will be different for different pieces of research.
Thank you, sir. Moving on to the next question from Haroon Khan. He's asked that what are the key criteria that distinguish a well-written literature review from a poorly constructed one? And how can theoretical frameworks influence the formulation of research questions in a specific scientific field?
Okay, so well, if you've followed all those steps that we've been talking about, and again, you are able to, when you write your literature review, when you present it in the form of a paper, for instance, and you make a presentation on it, and you're able to tell why what you selected was a necessity, and why what you ignored and did not select was also not significant. If you can explain that, and do that in the first few lines and then expound upon it, that's what the quality of a good literature review. Why, for instance, again, I'll give the same example. This is one of the most recent papers that I've written. When uh, I presented that paper or wrote that paper, there are people who were saying, I even put that to AI to give a review on my paper, and gave a very interesting review that much more could have been added. A lot of information, is out there, but that's not what I'm going into, because my focus is on the philological understanding, on why this particular verse, Yusikumullah fi auladikum, and then the following verses have been interpreted philologically to point out that the share of a daughter will be half that of a brother's. Where's the philological possibility that just confines it to that to that limitation? And is there any possibility of reinterpretation? So instantly, my literature review will be confined only to those exegeses that discuss the topic philologically. I will not be delving into the historical aspect, which could be important for a different kind of research. So if I can relate that to the confinement of my own research goal and explain why I'm not going beyond this, that's a good literature review.
Moving on, we have a question from Muhammad Islam. He asked that, is it necessary to organize a literature review geographically, starting with studies from developed countries, then regional, and finally local research?
A very, very important question in modern times, because when we talk about the gaps that I was just referring to, the gap identification, we do need to talk about um, uh, aspects as not just, have you covered the important theories to develop a relevant theoretical framework. As soon as you do that in modern research work, it's also important to bring in those discourses that had hitherto been marginalized or ignored. For instance, now the trend is never to include, as a general rule, the caeteris paribus, other things remaining the same, is always there. You can explain reasons why you're ignoring it, but generally speaking, in humanities and social sciences, for instance, you're talking about, let's say, the interpretation of a particular phenomenon, a particular law, a particular cultural trend, and you don't bring in feminist discourses. That's a major flaw. That's a major flaw. In modern times, even queer discourses, post-colonial discourses, the regions that have not been studied. I'll just give you an example. There was a presentation at McGill by a researcher, by a scholar from King's College, and I had a very good impression of King's College because my own grandfather had done his LLB from there. So, King's College was always a big college for us when we were growing up. So I had a lot of respect. And of course, I still have that respect. But the person came up and he was doing his, he had done his PhD on bullet, on Shah Hussein's Kafis. Many of you would know that already, and they are quite often begin Maya ni mein kinnu akha, dard vichhode da hal bhi. So his idea was, why is the mother invoked as a cry of pain? It was a long presentation with a lot of research. It came out of PhD dissertation, but the basic conclusion was that because of the cultural and social confinement and the compartmentalization or separation of genders, there was a lot of Oedipus complex in Punjabi poets. That was his thesis, right? Well, if you know, and I was like kind of jittery on my seat, and next to me was a very famous scholar, Dr. Fatma Sidat, who's one of the proteges of Amina Wadud. She was like, why are you fuming? And it was like, this guy should know something about Punjabi and Punjabi literature and why the feminine voice is used. Why Punjabi language uses feminine voice? That's a question. More, I mean, if you just think, I call it taqammus atafi. It's a term that I've coined, and I can explain why that is done. There's a culture, like, I mean, people who come from Punjab would know how difficult it is for the woman to fall in love, and why the Sufi poets thought that the sacrifices she has to make, and the risks she has to take epitomize the endeavor in true love, and they take on that. And of course, there's this idea of not of having God as the beloved, and not using feminine pronouns for God as the beloved. So the counter was also accepted. But in terms of the cry of pain, it's a commonly heard uh, cry of pain. Like one of my friends told me that a very famous Lollywood actor who's well known as a macho man, and on the screen he is quite often able to, fight about 6, 7 people at the same time and defeat all of them, was actually having was in a brawl, and this friend of mine who's a scholar of the Quran witnessed that fight, and the first smack that he got, the first punch that he got on the face, made him say, "Hi, Amiji." It's a cry of pain. You don't understand that context. You don't understand that language. You don't understand the intertextuality. You can come up with these interpretations, but they will never hold. And this is what partly Talal Asad and Sabah Mahmood were talking about, that the discursiveness requires, you go to the tradition, you find out. If you want to ignore it, fine, that's fine. But at least, first of all, understand it, because then you will be completely irrelevant in a certain context. Over there, you might be able to, get some applause. But when you come to the local context, it will be ridicule. I could give you 101 examples of these anomalies where some research work, I mean, again, this scholar from Princeton, she wrote a book where she was interpreting verses from Ghalib and Momin, and pointing out that Ghalib and Momin also had jihadist ideas through some of their couplets. And the way these couplets have been understood in the South Asian context is entirely different. So it's very, very important and very useful. And that's why, to researchers, I quite often emphasize that if you want to do research and you have a choice and it's to your liking, try to research in an environment to which you belong, because you'll be contributing something new, and you will have some special advantage, some very strong advantage in contributing to your field. I'll just give you one example. Like recently, there's a young researcher who's also interacting with us at LAMS, who developed new models of keyboards for Amazon, where research is possible in Urdu. Now, he's very highly placed. He graduated from Princeton, then did his master's from Harvard, and very highly placed at Amazon. And he, to add to that repertoire of devices, utilized his knowledge of his own language, and that became an instant hit. So, the advantage of knowing your geography, knowing your history, knowing your culture, even for a purely scientific research, becomes phenomenal when you are able to combine all these aspects together and come up with this interdisciplinary kind of approach to research.
Thank you so much, sir. We'll move towards the last question, which is from Rana Osman. He asked that how important is it to consider a scholar's historical and cultural background when interpreting their work?
Uh, Roxana, this time I must say each question was so important and so significant that one could have separate sessions on each one of them. I don't know if I've been able to justify in my responses, but they're intelligent and well-educated people here. So sometimes just sharing ideas is more than enough. Maybe it validates things they already know or adds some aspects, but I hope my responses are as useful as the questions that have been raised. Yes, this is something which I think is one of the most important um, aspects in research in humanities and even in social sciences. I don't know about how important that is in science. Maybe yes, maybe no. I don't know because my only area of research in something that could be scientific is in artificial intelligence. But otherwise, in humanities and social sciences, one of the most important things to ask. There was a time when researchers, especially in the age of logical positivism, were focusing on not bringing in argumenta ad hominem. You do not talk about the personality, do not talk about the cultural background. Just talk about the ideas and the facts that a researcher has presented. Those days are gone because so much interpretation is involved. It's important to know what is the historical background which informed a person, because that's how he's constructing his authority in research. That's how he's constructing that's how he's developing his vocabulary. That's how you need to know who are the people he's engaging with, who are the people he's responding to. Which, like for instance, I came across a work recently by a well-known scholar, and he was talking about epistemology. And some people asked me, why has he written that piece of work? And then I could tell by looking at the text and pointing out that basically he's responding to Jacques Derrida, he's responding to Michel Foucault, and he's kind of critiquing some of their ideas. And if you don't know what the person is, where is he coming from, you are not able to do that. I'll give you one last example on this. A lot of people are studying Shibli Nomani, for instance. So many people read Siratul Nabi by Shibli Nomani. But hardly anybody knows why he wrote that Sira. Why did he write it in the first place? I mean, on the one hand, he was giving a corrective to the approaches of the Sira writers who were using all kinds of sources, the good, bad, and the ugly together to construct stories and creating problems. And on the other hand, he was responding to the Orientals like Margaret and A.G. Wells of his time. And if you don't know that background, and his own training coming from Maulana Fazlul Saharanpuri, you will not be able to really understand the focal point. So I think having that kind of information is a huge advantage.
Yeah, I think I'll step in. We are way ahead of our time. We're beyond 10 minutes beyond our time. We have another session on research ethics, and many of you who have questions regarding that will be answered. May I also say that you have taken away space from questions by writing, by asking for certification, and that is very sad. We have repeatedly told you to be patient, and the certification of 3,000 people per session is definitely going to need time. If any of you is happy to help us in manning that station, please come over and help us out in printing and writing those certificates. Please be patient. You will be getting everything that we promised, so you have to bear with us. Asif, on another note, I see repeated comments about we need another session with this expert. He has so much to say. And, so people, many in the audience have caught up to the largesse of understanding and bringing in multiple. You relate examples that are from everyday life and all of us can relate to, and it makes it much easier. And yes, the topic is very, very vast and not everything can be covered. But like Asif covered, engaging with the text. And I think that is the key. The rest of the content that you were asking in the questions can be easily found in textbooks on Google. Even if you ask AI, it will give you the content very well laid out. What you will not get is this discourse that Asif stated to clarify what is the difference between a simple literature review that you think is getting material together and what is a real engaging with the text where you make your theoretical constructs and theoretical framework. And that is what makes your research excellent. And Asif, any last words over there if you would like to add?
I would have also wanted to talk about aspects of intertextuality, because when you actually
Yeah.
begin reading the text,
Yeah.
one of the most important things is talking about intertextuality, but maybe that we can do that at some other
Yeah,
point.
but I'm sure with the amount of information you have given, if they look up intertextuality on the net, you'll find very good explanations. I know Asif won't be there to put it into context and examples, but I guess there's a limitation of time. And thank you so much, Asif. As always, you floored the audience and we get very personal laudatory comments, always for you. Thank you so much, and we're not going to let you go. So stay put and stay strong. We'll be contacting you every year. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
Sana.